Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King. Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey.
Guilty.
Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell.
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran.
Not
Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy.
guilty.
Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue.
Not
Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman.
Not guilty.
Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts.
Not guilty.
Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
Guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders.
Guilty.
Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby.
Not guilty.
Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester.
Guilty.
Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis.
Not guilty.
Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey.
Not guilty.
Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen.
Guilty.
Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
There you have it. President Trump acquitted in the Senate, near party line vote. All the Democrats voting to convict, all the Republicans save one voting to acquit the president. Stark scene there on the Senate floor. No long speeches, just the senators standing at their seats and delivering their verdict on the president. There is one more article to come as the clerk tallies the roll right there. And Mary Bruce up there on Capitol Hill, you really could tell it's a different Senate convened for this trial.
Absolutely, George. It is remarkable.